Okay, let's jump right in. We often hear that Buddhism is religion, without a god, right? But what if I told you that in some traditions, goddesses are not only present, but they're actively worshipped? Today, we are digging into a really provocative hypothesis that tries to square this circle. It's a story that's about belief, yeah, but also about persecution and just how far a culture might go to survive.
So, let's start with the core contradiction that our source material lays out. On one side, you have this very common stated belief. Buddhism has no god. Simple enough? But then, on the other side, you have an observed practice, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, the real, active worship of some seriously powerful goddesses. So, how can both of these things be true at the same time?
To even begin to understand this puzzle, we've got to look closer. We need to see what the source is highlighting within Tibetan Buddhism. What does this so-called worship actually look like?
Well, the evidence is pretty compelling. The source points to Tibetan Buddhists invoking what are called fierce forms of tantric goddesses. They call on Tara, who's a major deity, sometimes seen as a female Buddha. They recite incantations, asking for protection, and there are all these stories of Tara swooping in to rescue her followers. You know, when you put it all together, it's pretty hard to call that anything but worship.
And this brings us right to the heart of the matter. If all these devotional practices are happening, why do so many Buddhists publicly say, nope, we don't believe in or worship a god? There's a huge gap here between what's being practiced and what's being said out loud. So the source we're looking at proposes a really controversial reason, and it has nothing to do with theology. It's all rooted in a painful history of political persecution. The whole theory boils down to a strategy for survival. And the source makes a very direct, very powerful claim. It basically connects this denial of God worship to persecution by the Chinese government. It even cites the killing of over 1 million Tibetans as a direct result of their worship practices, specifically being targeted for their devotion to these fearful deities.
So here's how the logic apparently played out. Step 1. You have a culture that openly worships its deities. Step 2. That worship brings down violent persecution. So, Step 3. To make the violence stop, the community starts to publicly deny what they're doing. And the end goal, Step 4, is simply to ensure their culture survives. It's a terrible choice to have to make, but a pragmatic one. And this is the real kicker of the whole hypothesis. The idea is that this denial, this no-God stance, isn't some original, ancient part of this Buddhist tradition. It's actually a pretty modern adaptation. A public face put on for self-preservation, all because they were facing a threat to their very existence.
Now, to back this up, the source draws a really interesting parallel. It looks at the suppression of Tantra in India, another spiritual tradition that came under massive political pressure from an outside force.
This comparison is fascinating, and it all revolves around Tantra, which, remember, shows up in both Hinduism and Buddhism, and often involves these powerful deity practices. So look at this. In Tibet, the threat was the Chinese government, and the reason given was the worship of fearful deities. In India, the threat was the British colonizers, and they called certain Hindu tantric practices barbaric. But in both cases, the source argues the result was the same. The tradition had to change its public identity to survive. One group denies God worship, the other tones down or gets rid of the very practices that were causing offense. Okay, so this whole line of reasoning, persecution leads to public denial, it all builds to a final, very bold, and honestly very controversial assertion about the origins of Buddhism itself. And there it is, the ultimate claim from our source, that the original Buddha actually did believe in and worship a god, specifically from the Tantric order. The whole argument is that this fundamental truth has been hidden and denied for centuries, not because the theology evolved, but because of intense, repeated political pressure.
So that leaves us with this really provocative question that kind of turns conventional wisdom on its head. Now, it is so important to say this is a controversial hypothesis. Mainstream Buddhist scholarship would absolutely offer different interpretations. But it's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it? Is the no-God stance we associate with Buddhism actually a modern tactic, born out of a brutal need to survive? Or is this whole theory a misreading of history? It forces you to wonder how much of what we know about any ancient tradition has been shaped less by its original beliefs and more by the messy, dangerous politics of survival.